Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. I hope you've had your coffee. I know I've had mine, so we're going to giddy up. I want to welcome Skagit and Boca Raton and those of you who are streaming in from home in your PJs. We're here with you in spirit. And today, actually, I want to start by telling you the story of what walked me into unexpectedly sitting in one of these church chairs. I myself was surprised that I found myself at Cornwall Church for the first time over 20 years ago. And I had no idea that my entire life was about to be turned upside down. Years of wounds, dysfunction, loneliness, abandonment issues, insecurities, secrets, all of this found me in places that racked up some pretty good reasons to be a real mess by the time I was a college student. And I had this insatiable longing, and all my attempts to fill it left me more and more empty. So a few years before walking into this church as a sophomore in college, I got a knock on my dorm door, and it was the guy from the night before who I barely knew. And he was crying and handed me a Bible, and he said he was sorry and ashamed for what we did together the night before. He might have felt guilty that day, but he sure didn't for years to come when he used me for what he wanted to. But that schmuck is actually how I landed my very first Bible. I put it on my shelf with no plans to ever open it up because for years prior I made fun of God's people and I threw the Bible back at the Gideons when they came on campus. I had no desire to trade grunge music in for hymns. I had no desire for people to tell me how to vote or what not to do with boyfriends. I knew that I would never scrapbook or like church potluck casseroles. Sundays were for nursing hangovers, and there is no God, I assumed, because where was he when I needed him most? And his people, they were judgmental, I thought, and dreadfully boring. But by my junior year in college, life started to fall apart for me, and I was walking to school and breaking down, and I started withdrawing from classes and family and friends. And I remember feeling so desperate with nowhere to turn, and I found myself in a hotel room. And I cannot tell you how I got there, but it was another night of fear and shame and vulnerability, where I found myself wanting to be rescued from the pain that had been inflicted upon me and the pain that I now inflicted upon myself and others. And so I just cried out in that room, not knowing if I was just talking to the walls. And I said, if there's anyone out there who can help me, God, if you're real, if you're alive, can you come and can you help me? This was my first conversation with God. I wanted to be found by him and him by me, but I was sure if he were real, he really wouldn't want anything to do with the likes of me. I was sure that I would call out like I remember doing as a kid after some god-awful experience with terror and nakedness and fear and the all-aloneness that's worse than all of it, wanting someone to hear me and rescue me, but no one would come. I was sure in that hotel room I would stand there wanting God to come, but he would leave me there in my want because somehow I deserved this. And my assumption that God would not enter my brokenness is one I have come to realize I share with many others, maybe even you. Well, after pleading to God, it wasn't like, abracadabra, behold, God in Motel 6. But I've often heard God described as the hound of heaven, and he stalked me. My hairdresser was Christian. My landlords were Christian. My coworkers were Christian. I went to a counselor, and she was Christian. I couldn't escape. I was surrounded. And at the same time, I opened up that darn black book that had been sitting on my shelf for over a year. It's like it had been staring at me, and it was called the Holy Bible. And I'd never read it in my life. And its words will pierce any open heart. And my heart was becoming as open as it was broken. And so I started reading on page 1. In the beginning. And it seemed like in the beginning things were awesome, and then they got really messed up. I mean, it seems like in the beginning, Adam, the first father, blew it, and then he ruined his sons, and they ruined their sons, and everything was a bloody, wounded mess with orphans and anger and widows and war and sad girls getting sloppy drunk and sleeping with boys to numb the pain. And I began to think, if these words are his words, the God who made everything in the universe and the God who knit me together in my mother's womb, what would he have to say about all of this pain? How was he going to rescue all of us? If he was real, I wanted to see God around every corner. I wanted to feel him. I wanted to hear him. I was talking to him like he's everywhere because he says that he is. I was taking his promises back to him, and I was expecting faithfulness. I was counting on him to show up because I was done with no-shows. I was looking for him to rescue me because I had been trying to rescue me since I was a little girl, and I was done. It was his turn. This was not religion. I wasn't messing around. I didn't have Christian expectations upon my life. I needed God to make sense of my pain and my story. And that might seem expectant, but I think expectancy is why I found God all over the place. So after a long pursuit on his part and mine, at the age of 21 years old, I handed my life to Jesus Christ. And when I say I handed it over, I mean quite literally, I could see my hands extending toward this one bigger than me. Handing over all of the pain and confusion and doubt and mistakes and sin and abuse and my body and my past and my present and my dreams. And the moment I gave my life to Christ was in a charismatic church in a room full of about 20 women who didn't speak my native tongue and didn't hold my same values. It was a very unlikely place to find me. But a woman God put in my life was just sassy and bold enough to love me in my mess, and she invited me, so I had said yes, and I go to this thing, and some lady looks at me and asks me my opinion on a topic, and I said, "Oh, I'm not a Christian, I probably shouldn't answer," and she said intensely, "What are you waiting for?" And I knew in that moment I wasn't waiting for anything except perhaps this moment of decidedness. The God that I'd been looking out for, I wanted him, and I hoped he wanted me too. And it was that moment that these sweet and well-intended women began praying over me in tongues, which scared the heck out of me because they're praying that I would speak in tongues too. And though I think it is possible, it wasn't happening for me. And so I thought, oh man, do I need to fake them out or wait them out? But I decided God was real and I would be too. So about a half hour later, I ran out of that place like a scary religious monster was chasing me, and I was sure I was never going to end up in church again. So you can imagine my hesitancy when I drove up to Cornwall Church by myself and parked my car in the parking lot the next week. And I said to God, God, if this is where you want me, help me to know. And I walked into this church and experienced a sense of belonging that I'd never felt before. And I wanted my commitment to Jesus to feel more my style, so I had a chat with God and marked the box on the communication card, I give my life to Christ. Well, the next week I was checking groceries to pay for my Long Island iced teas in college. And two guys randomly came through my line. They're buying massive amounts of baby food, and I'm a little sassy, so of course I start making fun of them, which was not in the job description, asked them why they had this. And they said, oh, we're youth leaders at the church that I had just divinely walked into. And I said, no way, I just visited that place. And they said, well, you should come and be a youth leader. And I thought, there is no way, not me. I mean, I had never been a part of a youth group, let alone qualified to lead one. I mean, I wouldn't have a clue how to make a 15-year-old play with baby food and turn that into a bestie friendship with Jesus. And I was like, I'm not even tight with God. I love peach schnapps and dancing to Bob Marley. I mean, I just don't fit the profile, right? But these men were so convincing. And so I showed up at this church's Rowdy Youth Group for the first time as a leader. A few days later, I was checking groceries again. And there's this lady, and she's standing behind me. So I turn around and I say, can I help you? And she looked at me, and in a British voice, I kid you not, she said, "I knew you when you were a little girl, and I need to meet with you." So I met with this woman that I didn't know, and Pam said her job was to go through the communication cards at Cornwall Church, this church I just randomly visited, right? And she came across my name and knew that there couldn't be another, and she remembered me as a child from living in my hometown all the way across the state, and she started to cry and said, "I used to see you playing on the streets when you were a little girl, and God told me that you were hurting and that you were going to need him. And so I've been praying for you for 15 some years. And you came into my church all the way across the state in another city and handed your life to Jesus Christ." Now we were both crying. See, because God knew I needed to see that he had been trying to break into my pain my entire life. So I showed up again as a youth leader the next week and the next week and the next. And I often felt insecure to help people for God, and I was sure I didn't belong and I wasn't good enough to be a leader. And the more I showed up to help the kids, the more Jesus started helping me, and these crazy things started happening, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night and words would come out my mouth, and I had to write them down because I couldn't wait to tell them to the struggling teenagers. And so I met with the youth pastor and his wife, and I said, "What do you think is going on with me?" And they said, "We think that you're being called into vocational ministry." I said, What's vocational ministry? And they said, "Duh, like when ministry is your career and your calling." And I was stomping my feet on the inside. No, not me. I was pursuing a business degree so I could rule the corporate world and make lots of big bucks. And I was planning on marrying Schmucky Bible Boy. And Jesus was my new friend. And I thought, well, he can come along with me. Right? I was not a Jesus follower. I was more like a Jesus dragger. Like, let's do this. And one day after class, I was walking a trail and words came out my mouth. It was my voice, but it was God's words. And he said, "I want to use your life to proclaim my power. I want more than what you're giving me. When you get off this trail, you decide, are you going to go your own way or are you going to follow me?" And I wanted to scream, "Not me." But when I stepped off that trail, I knew where I was going. I broke up with Schmucky Bible Boy and I applied to be a pastoral intern at this church. I was sure that they would find out who I was and turn me down lickety-split. On my third interview, I sat across from Pastor Bob, and he lovingly challenged and asked me if I would try preaching. I said, "Me? No way. I mean, I'll clean toilets and set up chairs and play dodgeballs and visit the elderly in nursing homes and talk to teenagers, but I will never speak up front and actually have something to say that will change lives. I've never taken Bible 1 or a speech class, plus people see my booty and no one needs to see that. No way, not me, never." And that's why this church turned me down to be an intern. So now I'm bitter. Of course they did, I thought, because I was looking for evidence of what I already believed about myself. I had the opportunity to be used by God to do amazing things, but I walked away because I didn't believe that God could use me. And I just wonder, how often do you walk away from opportunities to do amazing things because you do not see how it's possible? How often do you say, "Not me"? Because this "not me" has us dreaming small instead of big. This "not me" has us cowering in fear, saying no when we really actually want to say yes. This "not me" has some of us discouraged and disappointed in our career and our callings. This "not me" has us settling for ordinary, even at the invite of the extraordinary. This "not me" makes our God smaller and our faith even smaller. And this "not me" has some of you waiting. You're waiting to get cooler. You're waiting to get younger. You're waiting for this season to pass. You're waiting for a degree. You're waiting to get tighter with the big man upstairs. You're waiting for experience. You're waiting to sound more spiritual. You're waiting to look like Suzy. You're waiting for your confidence, your insecurities to be replaced with confidence. Some of you are even waiting for your personality and your talents to change. But you know what? You can wait till you're blue in the face, but that is not going to pull off amazing things in your life. John 6, the passage we're going to lean into today, tells a story about God doing something absolutely amazing through someone who surely thought, not me. And I am confident as we lean into this passage, God will meet each one of us in our doubt and discouragement, in our small dreams and our big fear, and he will speak in a personal and powerful way. And this miracle is recorded in all 4 Gospels, and it starts out with a huge crowd of people following Jesus because he's healing the sick. And you know, sometimes I think we read the Bible like we read CNN news, like thousands of people were displaced from their homes, like 6 people were shot at a mall, like another middle schooler committed suicide. When the Bible says a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he'd performed by healing the sick, these were people's mothers with cancer. These were people's brothers with mental illness. These were people's children with epilepsy, and Jesus was healing them. I would follow him too. I'd get some sunscreen and some trail mix and throw it in a fanny pack and go to Timbuktu to follow Jesus if he healed someone that I loved. Well, Jesus sees this mob of people coming at him, and I actually think that his response is hilarious. I mean, because I'm thinking he could have supernaturally vanished, poof, Jesus at an Irish pub listening to bagpipers. You know, or he could have broken people up and been like, let's get in groups and share your happies and crappies, but he doesn't do anything like that. He says to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people? And I read this passage and think, can't they just go home and have nachos later? I mean, come on, why does he have to feed them? And Jesus' question was to help Philip realize what Jesus already knew. Because we see in verse 6, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. How often are we in a scenario and we're freaking out and we're thinking, there is no way. Meanwhile, God is sitting there and he's confident in his plan. Maybe this can be our new mantra. When our kids come home from school and they're hurting and we have no control over making it better, maybe we can say, God already has in mind what he's going to do. When the love of our life decides that we're not good enough and we go to bed alone in our grief, we can remind ourselves God somehow already has in mind what he's going to do. When we're faced with an amazing opportunity and we see absolutely no way it's possible, maybe we can say to ourselves, self, you have a God who already has in mind what he's going to do. I just wonder how it would change our mindset if we stood confidently on this belief in all circumstances. And so Philip answers Jesus the way that I think we would. Yeah, when Satan ice skates to work on the first and never Jesus. Okay, he didn't really say that, but what he actually says is it would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. But notice Andrew sees differently than Philip, because Andrew says, here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many? Out of 5,000 people, Andrew spots some potential in this one boy and his loser lunch. Now imagine this boy. Imagine him. He's following the crowd. Who knows? Maybe he's just wondering what all the hullabaloo was about. Maybe he was intrigued by Jesus, or maybe his mama needed a miracle. Regardless of why this boy happened to find himself on the same hillside as Jesus, I'm 100% sure he did not think that he was going to get called out. And there he was with this little lunch, an inferior lunch no less. Barley bread was cheap. It was the bread of the poor. One commentator said barley was called the food of the beasts and an offering for a woman who's committed adultery. Ever feel inferior? Like what you have is not enough? This boy resonates, and yet Andrew sees in him potential. The definition of the word potential is latent qualities or abilities that may be developed and lead to future success or usefulness. Seeing potential in someone requires seeing something that may be developed but hasn't yet been. Seeing potential is why Pastor Bob asked me if I would preach over 20 years ago. He saw in me what I could not see in myself. And seeing potential in others requires us looking past obstacles, present status, abilities, weaknesses, failures. We often can't seem to see beyond the now. But God sees who a man was, who a man is, and who a man can become. Seeing potential in someone requires a foresight because of a trust in what God can do in another person's life. Seeing potential looks like you picking the least likely boy in a huge crowd with the smallest lunch and saying, "There's the ticket." The greatest enemy of seeing potential is only looking for success. Seeing potential in someone is not seeing success. Everyone can see success, people. Seeing potential is seeing something that is not yet. We have to be a people who see the potential before the proof. Imagine all the lives that are untapped of their God-given potential because God's people are only looking for success. When you look at your kids and your spouse and your friends and your coworkers and your employees and your volunteers, are you looking for success or are you looking for potential? We often don't see potential because we box certain kinds of people out, and when we box people out, we box God in. Our definitions of who God uses keep us from seeing his amazingness all the time. I mean, imagine being the scoffers on this hillside in this crowd, and at the suggestion of Jesus using a little poor boy's lunch, they probably thought what we often do, which is no way, because surely God only uses wealthy, put together, strong, educated, good-looking, charming, super spiritual people with accolades, impressive resumes, and lots of likes on Instagram. We so often box certain kinds of people out: the elderly, the disabled, the depressed, the odd, the sinful, the shy. And when we do this, we limit God's power because we limit God's people. And I want to know, who do we think we are to do that? Seeing potential in others costs you nothing. It might have cost Jesus Christ everything, but it doesn't cost you anything. As a parent, it's free. As a business owner, it's free. As a leader, it's free. As a friend, it's free. As a teacher, it's free. Seeing potential in others quite possibly might be the greatest impact move you can make in the world around you. Imagine the stories people could tell about how you called them up. Imagine the impact if we started being Andrews, calling out the God-given potential in the people who stopped believing that they had any. Untapped potential is quite possibly God's answer to so many of our world needs, and all we have to do is be like Andrew and call it out. We often don't see potential because we see in terms of possibility and not power. For being a people of faith, have we lost all hope in a God who holds the power to do powerful things? I think we might be like Philip, looking at impossibilities, certain that there is no way. We often don't give awesome things half a second to even have a chance to breathe. Can God pull off amazing things? Can God take what is small and make something big? Can God pull off the impossible? People of faith, please tell me that he can. Well, look at what Jesus does at the crazy suggestion of using a poor kid's hoe bread to feed the masses. Jesus sat them down and he took the loaves and gave thanks and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted, and he did the same with the fish. This was off the hook. And Jesus knew that what he was going to do both here on this hillside and this miracle was also what he would do one day coming soon. And we would see that later in Luke 22:19, the night before Jesus was crucified. He took bread, gave thanks and broke it, saying, "This is my body, broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Jesus knew that day with the 5,000 people that in the same way he broke bread and gave thanks to feed them, he too would give thanks and break bread to save them. See, because Jesus knew that we as a people would experience pain and hardship, betrayal, abuse, name-calling, breakups, and hangovers. And he knew that all of that would leave us with this attempt to satiate our own hunger, which would leave us even hungrier. And all of that hunger would steal our God-given worth and potential. So Jesus would end up choosing to give away more than bread, but his very self for all those who've ever felt hungry. But not yet. That was to come later. For now, Jesus' power pulled off something amazing through someone who was looked upon as inferior. Because that's what God's power does. God's power supersedes small and young and insignificant and messed up and bad track record and broke. God's power is not held back by disbelief or disadvantage. God's power is not intimidated by not going to happen, never, in no ways. God's power isn't restricted by impossibility, impracticality, or improbability. God knows what his power can do through one person's life, and God is not sitting around fretting about how he's going to write an amazing story in your life. God sees in us who we do not see in ourselves. He's the ultimate potential spotter, and we see this all the time in Scripture throughout history with his people, right? Because God saw Peter in Simon, who Simon did not see in himself. And God saw the woman who would be used to change her village and the get-around girl at the well. And God saw the preacher and Paul and the Christian killer Saul. And here God saw in this little lad and his weak sauce lunch a beautiful way to feed his people and an amazing story that would be told to inspire people to feed others for thousands of years to come. So imagine what God sees in you. You know, I think there's some people here today who have begun to give up on their potential. And so what I want to do with the rest of our time together is I want to tell you about the God that I ran into over 20 years ago who turned my not me into a yes you. He's a God who uses unlikely people to do amazing things. Throughout history, God used fraidy cats, punks, failures, and big bad sinners with painful stories and sketchy pasts to change lives. God picks the least likely people. If God used the people that we would, Goliath would still be bullying people, but instead, God used an insecure, unequipped young man who stepped up and didn't let insecurity and what he didn't have get in the way of what he was called to do. God used David to pelt an oppressive monster straight square in the eyes with a mere pebble to rescue his people. If God used the people we would, Gideon's people would still be oppressed while he put his confidence in his sissy baby self, but instead God found that unlikely wimp hiding in fear, peeing his own pants, and God used him to set his people free. If God used the people we would, the Israelites would still be slaves for Pharaoh, the Red Sea wouldn't have parted, and Moses would have let his stutter and disability determine what he was supposed to do with his life, but instead Moses allowed the call of God to be louder than his weakness, and that saved a nation. If God used the people we would, the 5,000 hungry humans would now be hangry, but instead God chose to use an unlikely little boy's lunch to feed a small city. So you can sit around until you're 95 and you can say, I'm too young, I'm too plain, I'm too stained, I'm too ungodly, I'm too different, I'm too much of a disappointment. I'm too. God's too. God's too big, too supernatural, too mighty, too majestic, too forgiving, too graceful. If you think that it's unlikely God can use you, you're in the right place. That's where Moses was in the burning bush. That's where Gideon was in the winepress. That's where Joseph was when his brothers threw him in a hole. God uses unlikely people so we know it's him. And when you start to believe this, it will be you that he uses. right? Because it's often when you're peeing your pants and you're stuttering and you're holding a bag of barley, it's right there in that kind of unlikeliness that God does his greatest work. He's a God who uses what confounds us. In 1 Corinthians, the Bible says God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are. The word shame here is more accurately the word confound, which means to destroy, baffle, frustrate, throw into confusion. God will confound you by who he uses. God will surprise you. He will not be predictable in his power. His power cannot be made sense by man. So then when God uses nitwits and depressed artists, recovering drug addicts, and socially awkward people, only God gets the props. It must have been his power, people will say. God wants to confound people with your life. Will you let him? He's a God who uses our weaknesses for opportunities to show his power. 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Your divorce, disability, bankruptcy, sickness, or addiction, any weakness that you feel that you have can be used as God's canvas to display his power. You think that's ludicrous. So is a little boy's lunch. So is a rod. So are 5 stones and a slingshot. So is God on a tree, hanging there for you and me. Salvation came through what looked like weakness, humility, suffering, wounds, and death because he's a God who uses pain. Isaiah 53 describes the one that was to come and change the world, the Messiah, what he would look like. It says he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Even God himself didn't use force or arrogance or the highest rung on a ladder or lots of letters after his name to do amazing things. He didn't use a perfect family line or a position of power or wealth or worldly ideals of strength to impact the world. God used not a crib, but a manger. God used not a because I told you so authority, but instead I'll show you so humility. God used not a long line of Christian nobility, but instead a family tree that was about as crooked as can be with harlots and heathens that birthed this DNA. God used not a throne, but a cross. God used not success, but suffering. God used not a strong hand of punishment nor a power play, but instead he laid down his life in a salvation move that was well played. And yet we think it's going to be by our clout, our titles, our magnetism, our awesomeness, our cool factor, and our strength that does amazing things. Who are we kidding? What has God used to do amazing things? Wounds. He wears them like the shirt on his back. He wears the wounds that caused our wounds and the wounds we now inflict upon others. And he says with his life, these won't keep you from me. Your wounds won't have the final say. My wounds will determine who you will be. God isn't running from your brokenness. He wiped your brokenness all over him. If your brokenness didn't keep God from saving you, it sure as heck isn't going to keep him from using you to do amazing things with your life. And some of you have been hurt, and you still live in fear, and your fear is paralyzing your destiny. And some of you don't trust anybody, man, because nobody's been trustworthy. And your trust issues are holding you back from great things. And some of you have been wounded by the church, and those wounds are keeping God and his call in your life at a distance. And some of you are sure that your mess will follow you everywhere you go, so you've just stopped dreaming. And some of you have been told that you don't have what it takes to do great things, and you've started to believe it. And you know what? You can believe all those lies because that's what our brokenness does. Our brokenness lies to us. But we have a God who can take everything you've ever been through, and instead of writing you off, he can write the best stories with it. God does his greatest work through pain, his and ours. So allow him to meet you in your brokenness and use you there too. Decades ago, after being turned down to be an intern at this church because I wasn't willing to believe God could use me preach, Jesus challenged my confidence problem. Everything I saw in Jesus in that darn black book that Schmucky Boy gave me made me turn around. So I went back to Pastor Bob and I said, God told me never say no to what I can do through you. So here I am, Bob. And I'm taking him at his word that he could use even me. And that was the day when I stopped saying not me to myself, but instead yes, you to God, that I became an intern at this church almost over 20 years ago. And the pastors threw me in with the wolves. No speech class, no Bible 101. And I had to get up and talk to like 100 teenagers about God in a way that would impact their lives. There wasn't anything in me that thought this was a great idea. And there I was on a stage with a mic in hand. I shared just a piece of my story and how Jesus met me there. And afterwards, this high school girl came up to me and said, I know what it's like to hurt too. My stepdad beats me. She wanted my rescuer, so we wanted him together. And for over 20 years now, God has had me doing this thing that I never thought that I would do. And it's been like getting front row tickets to see the greatness of what only God could do in the lives of people who need him desperately. And over again, I've been that same girl with pain in my pocket and a God who meets me there. I still have to fight the not me. I'm fighting it right now. I'm still the girl with no Bible 101 and no speech class and a bigger booty. I mean, oh my gosh, how's God going to use me? And now God has me leading this ministry called Collide. And it's a whole nother fish and loaves story for another time. But because of my work, I preach often, which is pretty comical, right? And I was on my way to speak at a women's retreat last year. And the mean old not me's just started firing arrows. And I write about this story in the Yes You Bible Study book that we just put out for women that you guys can check out today. We just published those and we're really excited about them. But on the way to this retreat, I was overwhelmed by how little I felt like I had to give. And I was feeling fatigued and faithless and thinking, how can God use me like this? And the last thing I wanted to do, if I'm being honest, was leave my family for another weekend away. I preached and did Q&As and sat and listened to stories and prayed over women. And after my last message and saying goodbye, truthfully, I was so ready to get home and get in sweats and cuddle my kids and sleep that I was like running out the door but trying to look like I wasn't. And wouldn't you know it, right at the door, a woman stopped me and shocked me with the seriousness of her story. She said, I want to die. I want to go upstairs and I want to take pills and I want to fall asleep and I never want to wake up again. This was a woman who was married and had children. And I put my bags down and I put my not me's down, and my friend and I knew that we needed a supernatural God-sized miracle. And so we started praying over this woman, began fighting for her will to live and fighting for her hope. And we started ministering to her and asking God to rescue her. And then we handed her to her community so that she could get the help she needed, and that she has done, and recently reached out to me a year later and said that she's doing amazing. But all I knew driving home that night was that our not me's do nothing for this world. Our not me's do not help people who want to end their lives. Our not me's do not give hope back to people who've lost all theirs. Our not me's do not comfort people in grief. They do not come alongside the lonely. Our not me's do not raise orphans who have no parents. Our not me's do not feed the hungry. Our not me's do not preach good news to people who are desperate to hear the good news. but our yes yous. They're all we've got, and they're all God needs. This story in John 6 ends with thousands of people having their fill, and there's more left over than they even started with. And Jesus says, let nothing be wasted. And so they gathered them and filled the 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who'd eaten. And what strikes me most about this story is that Jesus used what this boy had. That's what God does. He uses what we have. Not what others have, not what we think we need, but what we already have, our story, our experience, our pain, our learning lessons, our weaknesses, our strengths. Nothing, God says, will be wasted. God doesn't need us to go out and get another lunch to pull something off really great. We just have to hand over what we already have. Right? For God to use this boy to write an incredibly worthy story, he was going to have to hand over his lunch. Right? He was going to have to decide, is he going to hoard all the fish and loaves for himself? Is he going to laugh off the whole suggestion as mockery? Or is he going to claim, not me, no way, never? This boy must have gotten to the place where he held out his measly lunch, handing it to God, trusting Jesus' power could do something with the little that he felt he had. The greatest stories worth telling are told through people who believe in the greatness of what God can do through them. God will use your life to do amazing things when you start to believe that he can. Yes, you. So today I want to pray for us. I'm going to ask you to stand. And I want to give each one of us the opportunity to hand God what we have. And I actually want to invite you to hold your hands out like this, like the day I did when I gave my life to God and many times since. And I'm going to walk us through a prayer. God, we hand you what we have. And we hand you what we don't. God, we hand you our strengths and our talents. We hand you our mistakes and our pain and our insecurities and all our not me's. We hand you our hopes and our dreams. Today, Jesus Christ, we hand you our whole life, and we ask that you would take it and do amazing things through us. In Jesus' powerful name, amen.